All right, philosophy class, we're now turning on to chapter 3 in the Palmer text, covering in this area empiricism, and specifically looking at the philosophy of John Locke. All right, so John Locke, in the early part of this chapter, you will see some descriptions there of John Locke. He taught at Oxford University. He was from England, and an extremely influential philosopher for the individuals who were creating the United States, at least early on in the United States government. Many of these individuals, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, would have been heavily influenced by John Locke. So John Locke, when you cover this philosopher, you'll see a great deal of focus on epistemology, empiricism, but you'll also see his involvement then in the rights of the individual because of the empiricism, the rights of the individual in the areas of economics and politics. So focusing on the creation of capitalism in economics, and then democracy, or some form of democracy, representative democracy in politics. So Locke, as you can see here, believed we can only know what we experienced, although he did make an exception to allow for the rational explanations of the existence of God. So picture this. If our minds are like a white sheet of paper, tabula rasa, how does it get filled? Only through experience. So his point would be, his belief was that when we are born, we're like that white sheet of paper. We're like a vacant whiteboard. And all of that is filled in through experience. So in this case, then, we can see the difference between rationalism and empiricism and the importance of experience. In some ways, do we come back to empiricism, simply because we can't really understand it otherwise? So for example, could a person blind at birth know the color orange? How would we even begin to think that they would know what the color orange is if you, in a sentence, talk about the football team with orange jerseys on to a blind person? What would that mean? Well, to empiricists like Locke, it would mean nothing. That part of that person's experience is blank. Now, in the differences you can see here in this, the different pictures here on the screen, is to look at rationalism, that the ideas are developed and the understanding, the knowledge in the mind, and it emanates outward. And with empiricism, the experiences are outward and then they come inward, right? That we then experience it, and through our senses, we then are able to understand. That's how we get knowledge. So in many ways, we do see how empiricism is dominant because we are left with our experiences. Is that what it's most likely for us to rely upon? And certainly Locke would argue that it is. But when we look at experience, we can break it down in different ways. So is sensation a personal experience? And there may be times in which, in fact, it is. And this is where we start to see the development of individualism. So do we all experience sensations all in the same way? That depends on the qualities of the sensation. So there are primary qualities, and these we do experience in the same way. These qualities lie within the objects themselves. So such as extension, shape, motion, and something that is impenetrable, right? We would all experience that same sensation. Those are the primary qualities. It is worth thinking, do we in fact experience these the same way? We can also see then that Locke is wanting to have a universal viewpoint towards mathematics. But then there are also secondary sensations. And secondary sensations produce real qualities that are inherent in the things themselves. We subjectively experience these sensations. So that's important to consider too. Primary sensations are objective. They're beyond an individual perspective. But secondary sensations, these are subjective. We have different responses to these sensations and different interpretations. And that, as a result, we start to see the development of individuality. Color might be one of these examples. Color is one of these examples, to clarify that. What color is this shirt? So put your answer on chat, all right? Let's see some different descriptions here about that. So when you see this color, how do you describe it? What are you experiencing? And how would you then describe it? And how would you describe it to someone else with the assumption that they would see the same thing you're seeing? Is that possible? So let's go into greater detail here in discussing this and think about what color would you pick if you wanted calmness. So again, are you able to, in some ways, have this subjective experience about color that you would think other people will experience too? So if you were in a situation where you needed a color that would create calmness, what color do you pick? What color would you pick if you wanted intensity? In some ways, you can think about if you're selling a particular product and maybe in the atmosphere of what you're selling, you want a calm atmosphere. Well, then what color would you have on the wall of your store, or colors? And the opposite there, if you're wanting to have a really intense situation and the people who are in your store are, kind of on edge, fired up, however way we want to look at it, what particular colors would you use in that case? So when we start to talk about subjective sensation, we are meaning then that there is an individual. We are individuals. We started to think about that some with Descartes, that we have this individual conclusion about our existence. Does the individual experience existence differently? And here we can see Locke's contribution. From Locke's belief in the subjectivity of experience comes his belief in the importance of the individual. You experience that color different than I do. We might have some similarities, but might there also be some differences? You experience a taste different than I do. Therefore, we are unique individuals with subjective sensations. Should we then live in a society that reflects that individuality? And so here's where we can see the use of Locke focusing on empiricism, epistemology, one of the great pillars of philosophy, and then it starts to transcend into another important pillar of Western philosophy, and that's political philosophy. And so we'll certainly go into more detail about this later, but here you're looking at the individual as the basis of Locke's political philosophy. We are part of a greater system, and yet we are also individuals. So anytime you're in a political state, you are part of a greater system. And yet, can you also remain an individual? To Locke, the state of nature is a moral state where we all have certain God-given rights, which include life, liberty, health, and possessions. Property comes before government. This becomes a very radical idea that the importance of the individual to Locke means that there are situations and there are rights that are above the state, that are above the government. And so they come from God, or perhaps also then looking at the state of nature. And so life, liberty, health, and possessions. And we can see the influence there in the Declaration of Independence. Now, what we can also see are some conflicts. Are there times in which those can't apply? All possessions, all the time, above the needs of the government? What about taxation? Health in all situations, or are there times in which that may not necessarily occur? And life and liberty in the same way. But we see here the importance of the individual. So we now see this concept known as the social contract. If rights are given by God, then they cannot be taken away by governments unless circumstances have proven that an individual has broken the social contract. That is to be the contract. The contract is you obey the laws of the state, and the state then does not interfere with your natural rights, your God-given rights. Of course, the question can now emerge, these are complicated issues. What exactly would be a God-given right in all circumstances? And added to that would be, does the individual have to obey a law that might in some ways be perceived as interfering with a God-given right? So can't people interpret those differently? That can be why we have the courts. And it can also be a question to say, do we really even need to think about these particular rights beyond the state and how we interpret individual freedom? But let's look at this question then of social contract. One of the big concerns can be in a society is, do you have a situation where the financial gap among people, or perhaps in other situations, you have individuals who are not required to obey the social contract? In other words, they may not necessarily need to pay the same or follow the same rules, follow the same laws. And perhaps in their financial situation, they're not susceptible to a punishment. There actually was at one time, and I believe it's still in place, that the country of Finland would charge people who violated their traffic laws, would charge them not a sit fine, but a fine based on their ability to pay. So some individuals for one particular violation may only pay $50, where another individual might pay $500 because they're able to pay more. So after all, if you say to someone that makes only $30,000 a year, and you're going to now fine them $10,000, you have now fined them 1/3 of their salary for that year. But if someone makes $1 million and you fine them $10,000, that's far more manageable. So might they now think it's not really worthwhile to obey the social contract? If a company is polluting in the environment And now there are state regulations and fines that they pay because of the pollution. But they also then experience a greater profit margin because of the pollution, then they may be willing to pay the fine and not really change their behavior. And so that then raises the question, how do we get everyone to obey the social contract? So again, when you think of the social contract, think of this trade-off. Like any contract, there's an agreement. One person does a service, they get a payment, that type of situation. Government protects individuals, individuals abide by the laws of the state. Again, what if an individual views that the laws of the state are violating some of their key areas of rights? And so we can see that this doesn't put the debate to rest when you look at the social contract. And that's where we can turn to what we have here in the United States. We look at liberty in the United States, freedom, individual freedom, freedom from the government, that you have these opportunities to express yourself through religion, through speech, press, assemble, so you can associate with others, and you can also express your complaints about the government. When can this happen? When are there limits? Are there ways in which the state should interfere in some of these if in fact it's causing harm to someone else's rights? And I think we can see through many examples here where that could be the case. I'll just throw out one, but to look at freedom of religion and the issue of having individuals, having a family deny medical treatment for a child. Is freedom of religion worth more than the care of that individual child? And something there to ponder. And I would imagine many of you have thought about those type of situations from time to time. And so we look here at that there needs to be some form of toleration. And the way to do that is to look at the important difference between the Commonwealth and voluntary societies, and then to ensure that there has to be this separation. And so the Commonwealth that we're all part of is to advance its own civil interest. And we all should in some ways participate in that. But we can also join voluntary societies. And we find for example, with religion, our own way as an individual to enjoy that and to appreciate it. However, that does not mean that an individual would have the right to be able to demand that other people follow that same form of expression. And this is where we can see the foundation of the separation of church and state. All right, there. We got a lot to cover dealing with Locke, very important contributor to Western philosophy. Again, two main areas, empiricism and then also in political philosophy. And we can see how those two are connected together. We'll continue on with some of our issues, our review of empirical epistemology in our next recording.